No, okay. I think we're going to run it. But yeah, the cover that you can see here on the screen is the second edition of the book that was published in the 1960s. So it's a book that has been published twice, and the second edition then published over 30 years after the first one. We get to that later on in the talk. Now, the author, R.M. Fox, his full name was Richard Michael Fox. And although he did live in Dublin for more than half of his life, he was not actually from Ireland. He was born and raised in England. He was born in Leeds in 1891, the second of four sons. His mother was a teacher and his father an engineer. And when he was a child, the family moved from Leeds to London. And then he went to school in London, was a very bright student. And when he turned 14 years of age, like so many children back then, he celebrated his 14th birthday by leaving school and going to work in a factory. And he worked in different factories in London throughout his latter teenage years. And we can see a photograph of a young R.M. Fox here during his time working in factories. He became very politically active in his late teens. He became a convinced socialist and would become known within left-wing circles in London around the time of the First World War. And we can see a photograph of him here giving a speech at a socialist rally in London. He did have some Irish ancestry, but it was contemporary events in Ireland that actually got him interested in what was happening across the Irish Sea. It was the 1913 lockout in Dublin that really sort of got his attention when Jim Larkin's Irish Transport and General Workers Union battled William Martin Murphy and over 400 employers in Dublin that were trying to destroy this new militant trade union. And then a few years later came the 1916 Easter Rising, and Fox described the rising as the first crack in the as yet undisputed rule of the imperialists. So that gives you an idea of his politics, but he was very interested in Ireland and Dublin around this time, around this 1913 to 1916 era. And during the First World War, R.M. Fox would spend several years in prison, both during and shortly after the war, because he refused to enlist in the British Army or help the British war effort in any way. Now, because he was an engineer, he had what was called a trade exemption. So he did not actually have to enlist in the army. He could carry on working in factories and help the war effort that way. But he chose to give up his trade exemption and then refused to enlist in the army, even though this meant him going to prison. And when the war was over and he was given the option of joining the army again, even after the war was over, he refused. So he was returned to prison. So very much a man who lived by his principles. And what's interesting about this period in his life is that just before the war had started, Fox won a scholarship to go to Oxford. So although he came from a fairly working class family, he won a scholarship to go to Oxford, but because of the war, that got put on hold, and then he was in prison. So it was not actually until 1919 that he was able to go to Oxford, and he graduated then with a university diploma in economics and political science. So an intellectual, somebody who had always been good at school and did receive the opportunity to go to university when the war was over. When he finished his diploma at Oxford, he went to Russia, and then he would settle in Dublin. He moved to Dublin around 1922. And shortly after arriving, he married this woman here, Patricia Lynch. She was a militant suffragette that he had known for many years in London. And in Ireland, she would go on to establish herself as a really successful children's author. She's perhaps best remembered for her book, The Turf Cutter's Donkey, the front cover of which was designed by Jack B. Yates. So Patricia Lynch, then his wife, became a very successful children's author. Fox would be a prolific journalist, and he would also be a theatre critic, and he would write historical works as well. And among his best known historical works are biographies of Big Jim Larkin and James Connolly, also the trade union leader Louis Bennett. And then there's the book that he wrote about the Irish Citizen Army. And you can see a photograph here that was taken in 1943. I'll circle Fox for him. This is him presenting his manuscript of an officially commissioned history of the Irish Citizen Army. So by then he'd convinced these veterans of the organization that he could be trusted with sources and with interviews to give a glowing account of the Irish Citizen Army. And the woman who's sitting at the far end on the left is Dr. Kathleen Lynn. Some of you might recognize it there. And then right to R.M. Fox's left is the Dublin poet Maeve Kavanagh MacDowell, one of the 12 women in his Rebel Irishwomen book, as we'll see. And when Fox moved to Dublin, he lived in a few different places. He lived in Rathfarnham. He also then moved to several addresses in and around Drumcondra. You can see a postcard here that was sent to him and his wife when they were living at Walter Terrace off the Richmond Road. That was in the 1920s. And then the next decade, 1934, he's living at Stella Avenue, again in Drumcondra. And then he would later move to the Rise off Griffith Avenue, close to Ballymun Library. And this is a letter towards the end of his life. He wrote a piece for the Irish Times, and the assistant editor was under the impression he'd done it for free. But of course, Fox, as a professional writer, never wrote anything for free. So Fox then lived at the Rise. I'll show you some photographs of the house, or photograph there, and on the street sign there. It's just off Griffith Avenue, and I took these photographs when I was walking between Ballymun Library to Drumcondra Library a couple of years ago. So now that we've gotten the author sort of out of the way, we can move on to the subject of talk here today. His 1935 book, Rebel Irishwomen. And it was described in the blurb there, which I'll zoom in on so you can read it more clearly. It was described as a book that contained a dozen essays about women who figured in the Irish Revolution or whose rebel sympathies brought them into close contact with the sufferings of that eventful time. And it's interesting that it notes at the top that it is well recognized that women played an active and influential part in recent years in the struggle for Irish independence, because that wouldn't be always the case over the coming decades. The book is around 40,000 words long, and the 12 essays are a very sympathetic. Fox describes the essays in his foreword as being about women who took a leading part in national and social struggle. And 8 of the 12 essays had already been published elsewhere in a magazine in New York called The Monitor. And Fox would describe this as an Irish-American journal, and certainly had an awful lot of Irish content, a lot of Irish contributors, including some of the subjects of the Rebel Irishwomen book. And he published these in 1930, 1931. And what's interesting is that when he first published these 8 original essays for a New York magazine, the title of the series was Modern Irishwomen. But then when it came to 1935, the book being published with 4 extra essays, it had gone from being Modern Irishwomen to Rebel Irishwomen. And an obvious question to ask is if this is an appropriate title. certainly some of the subject would have had no problem being described that way. For example, Charlotte Despard, the suffragist and a Labour activist. She's seen here with some other Republican women staging a sit-down strike outside Mountjoy prison in support of Republican hunger strikers. I believe the photograph was taken in 1923, shortly after the Civil War came to an end. And Charlotte Despard was once quoted as saying that, I am a rebel. I became a rebel because I believe it is only by becoming a rebel that we women can get things done. So she would have had no problem being in a book with that title. However, the woman who, according to some accounts, is there beside her, Mary McSweeney, will perhaps beg to differ. Because rather embarrassingly for Fox, in his essay about Mary McSweeney, a Cork politician and teacher, she's actually quoted in his essay as saying that she's not a rebel because she says, a rebel is one who opposes lawfully constituted authority, and that I have never done. In other words, she refused to recognize British authority in Ireland. So although they might consider her a rebel, she thought it was perfectly natural to oppose British rule. So she vehemently, is the word she uses, to reject any notion that she's a rebel, even though this quote is in an essay about her life in a book called Rebel Irishwomen. And the fact that she was very critical of the Irish Citizen Army back in 1916, she described the Citizen Army as a rabble that the Irish volunteers should not have been getting mixed up with. Makes it curious that she ends up in this collection. And it seems reasonable to assume that had Fox been aware of her criticism of the Citizen Army in the past, he would not have wanted to include her in his book, because he was somebody who was very supportive of the Citizen Army, and 1/3 of the women in the Rebel Irishwomen book were Irish Citizen Army veterans. And I suspect that it was the publisher that might have been responsible, because Talbot Press, as well as having an office on Talbot Street in Dublin, they also had an office in Cork. So I suspect that they come up with the title of the book and also asked that when he adds a couple of essays, he does not only Mary McSweeney, but also another woman from Cork, Mary Harris, otherwise known as Mother Jones, a legendary figure in American Labour history. Somebody who's gotten a lot more recognition in recent years. There's a plaque in Cork. There is an annual festival named in her honour. And in Dublin, there's a plaque at Liberty Hall which quotes Mother Jones. And then in the Epic Museum down the Quays, there's a display dealing with some events from her life. So the book was published then in 1935, just in time for the anniversary of the Easter Rising. And in late 1934, Mary McSweeney sent a long letter to Fox listing various corrections that she wanted in his essay. He had given her proof of the chapter about her life, and she wanted him to make lots of different changes, because she said that this will help us avoid much unpleasant criticism about the exaggerations and inaccuracies. And that kind of gives you a clue about his style of writing. He was glowing with praise about the subjects of not only this book, but other books that he wrote as well. And when he wrote the initial 8 essays for the New York Magazine, it went very much under the radar in Ireland, but there was the essay on Countess Markievicz, which ended up getting back to Dublin, and the Unpublished newspaper, the Republican newspaper in Dublin, praised this essay in February 1931. And then when Rebel Irishwomen was published 4 years later, one of the other women in the book, Maeve Kavanagh MacDowell, who we saw earlier sitting beside Fox, she wrote a letter to Fox, a private letter, thanking him for the book and including her in the collection. But she was more keen to talk about the essay on Markievicz than the one on herself. And she praised it, and she said that reading the essay about Constance, she said, I felt more keenly than ever that it was you who should have written her life for the Ireland that she served so well. And this was a not so veiled reference to a 1934 biography of Markievicz, written by Sean O'Phelan, that was critical of Markievicz at different times. And even in the subtitle, they refer to her as an average revolutionary. And I'll always remember one review of this biography in which the reviewer said that he got the impression the author began the book in sympathy with Markievicz and finished it in sympathy with her husband. But this was a book that annoyed a lot of people, including Maud Gonne MacDowell. She said in her letter to him that he had been frightfully complimentary towards her and the other women, but she praised the book and said, it's the high tribute of a generous soul to women who saw the light and followed it to the best of their different capabilities. And similarly, Maud Gonne McBride, who we saw earlier, the woman who was chosen to have her photograph on the front cover of the first edition, she wrote a letter to Fox, again thanking him for the book and including her in the collection. But she admonished him. She said, "You said too many good things about us all." But she went on to say that the book was a wonderful achievement with some beautiful writing. And in another letter, she had said that it was a very encouraging essay, and she thanked him again for all the kind things that he had to say about the work that I've tried to do. Now, of course, this approach of praising all of the women in the book, it was not to everybody's liking. And there was an Irish Times reviewer in 1935 that was not very impressed with the book when it came onto his desk. He said that these are a dozen of the most adulatory and uncritical appreciations I've ever encountered. And he went on to describe it as a collection of propagandist articles that were suitable for the ultra-Republican movements. So this was a very critical review, and it led to Fox writing a letter dismissing the review. And then there was a month-long spat played out in pages of the Irish Times, where every week Fox and the anonymous reviewer refused to back down. But for the most part, the book was given very enthusiastic reviews. You can see one here that was in the Irish Press newspaper by Dorothy McCardle. She was an author and a Republican activist and historian, and she defended in her review his generous style of writing. There's a wonderful expression where she says that failure to appreciate is a much more stupid and a much more common fault than failure to condemn. And her admiration for Fox and the subject of the book really sort of shone through her review. She remarked that 12 women live vividly before us in the pages of R.M. Fox's book, appearing against a background cloudy with the smoke of revolution, each in turn playing her eager part. He has not over-dramatized the lives of which he writes or colored the portraits too highly, but neither has he striven, as many modern biographers do, to protect himself against the charge of hero worship by derogatory touches. His enthusiasm is transparent. There are no dark shades in his studies. His 12 rebels are not shown even as having the defects of their qualities. R.M. Fox's writing of women who are his heroines and friends, his judgment is that of a generous mind which so delights in fine human qualities and has such joy in praising as to remain oblivious of defects. And like all of Fox's books, really, Rebel Irishwomen is a very easy book to read, I think it's fair to say. He was a journalist by trade, and he wrote his history books like a journalist. There was lots of anecdotes, nice turns of phrase, very little reference and no footnotes, no endnotes. So sometimes you would have no idea where the sources he was getting his information came from. But certainly when it comes to Rebel Irishwomen, he's helped by the subject matter. One of the women that he writes about, Hanna Sheehy-Skeffington, wrote a short review of the book for a London publication, and she described it as racier than any thriller breezy with life and humour, for no dour folk are these women who chose to live life dangerously. And she said in her review that Michael Davitt's view that women, when rebels, are more uncompromising than men, and therefore valuable and indeed necessary assets in any revolutionary movement. That was a notion she felt came across when reading the 12 essays. So somewhat surprisingly, it did take until 1967 for the second edition to come out of the book, by which time only one of the dozen subjects, Nora Conley O'Brien, was still alive. And Fox's essay on Nora is by some distance the longest in his collection. And unsurprisingly, again, it heavily features her father, James Conley. The second edition of the book then was published by a small publisher in Dublin called Progress House. It was a cheap paperback that they brought out. And the front cover is very striking. The colors obviously were chosen very deliberately, that color scheme of green, white, and orange. And the 6 women on the front were the 6 are best known women out of the 12. So you have Nora Conley O'Brien, perhaps Helena Maloney, Maud Gonne, McBride, Hanna Sheehy-Skeffington, Countess Markievicz, and Charlotte Despard. And these women are depicted on the cover as being worthy of having stamps issued in their honor. And in the second edition, Fox wrote a little foreword in which he said that these were first-hand accounts of the activities, hopes, and aspirations of women as expressed by themselves while they were all actively engaged in national and social struggle. So lots of interviews he carried out with the women back in the 30s, and he quotes from the different women throughout the various essays, with the exception of the Mother Jones one, because he never had a chance to meet her. But the rest of the women, for the most part, were friends of him and his wife. So I'll just read you a few quotes from the book, because for anybody who has not had a chance to read it, I'm sure you want to try and get a sense of what the book was like, because you've heard people praise it, you've heard a person in the Irish Times criticize it, but he did have a very unique style of writing, and immediately when you begin reading R.M. Fox's history books, he definitely had a very specific style. And he describes Constance Markievicz, for example, as a living flame. She lights up everything that was fine and glorious in the 1916 Easter Rising, one of the noblest episodes in our human story. She was an aristocrat, a slight, erect, highly strung, eager woman, and she wanted that finest of all democracies, a nation of aristocrats. Although she burst on the world like a meteor in 1916, the struggle was for her the culmination of a period of preparation. She was a sword of light. So Markievicz describing as a living flame and a sword of light. And another of the essays dealt with her sister, Ava Gore Booth. And Fox remarked about Ava that in life, she never desired to dominate. In death, she dominates no less by the strength of her belief and the loveliness of her poems. None who knew her could fail to feel sorrow when they heard of her death, yet her beautiful spirit shines through a golden net of words. And if we can conceive a time in the future when Ava Gore Booth's name will be forgotten, then be sure that in that far-off generation, in the sweetest note and in the clearest light, her spirit will at least live. And then we saw Charlotte Despard earlier, the suffragist and Labour activist. About her, he said that she is not only a national, but an international figure, known wherever people are interested in progressive social movements and revolutionary thought. Mrs. Despard was a woman of unusual courage, who would not flinch under any circumstances. When she was born a girl, a great general was lost to the world, but again the worker for social progress, which it could spare. And I'll just show you another one. Helena Maloney, the trade union leader, a Republican activist who was in 1916 with the Irish Citizen Army. He said that the most valuable heritage of the Irish Labour movement today is the James Connolly tradition. And if there is one person who embodies this tradition more than any other, it is Helena Maloney, for she worked side by side with James Connolly to create it. Connolly, Helena Maloney emphasizes, with the driving force in 1916. Looking back on those days, she declared, it seems as if he made the rebellion. But second only to Connolly was the little group of women of whom Helena Maloney was one. She was an uncompromising Republican, and her activities helped to fuse the national with the Labour ideal. And then Grace Gifford Plunkett, the essay in her life deals a lot with her widow, with Joseph Mary Plunkett, who she obviously married in Kilmainham jail shortly before his execution in 1916. And Fox remarks about that story. He says, around the story of Grace Gifford, who married Joseph Plunkett, the 1916 rebel leader, at midnight in Kilmainham jail chapel, just before his execution, legends and myths are already gathering. But the simple truth has qualities of tragedy which belong only to the high moments of real life. Grace Plunkett will remain as one who, for her generation and for those who will come after her, she has lit the candles of sacrifice, of honor, and of truth before the altar of life. And then I'll just finish up from the quotes by quoting from his essay on Dora Maguire, a nurse from London, certainly the most obscure of his 12 rebels. He said in his essay about Dora that whenever a battle had to be fought or a word had to be spoken, Dora Maguire was there with her confident smile, never making demands on anyone else and never sparing herself. It was for the poor that she struggled, that she faced hardship, unemployment, imprisonment, and insult. The life of this delicate woman was a martyrdom endured proudly, for she would never lower her flag, not an inch. It was this spirit, the spirit of Dora Maguire, which gave us 1916 and will yet give us a clean world where national oppression and the wrongs of the poor will cease to exist. Dora's dark, smiling eyes were as much a part of Ireland as the grey mountains and the green fields. So you really do get a sense that these women are personal friends of his when you read the essays. And I'll just mention that in 2018, at the GPO Witness History Museum, I curated a Rebel Irishwomen series, which was a lot of fun to organize. It was 12 monthly lectures about the 12 women in the book. And for most of them, we had an actress called Susan Bracken who would read extracts from Fox's essays, and then a different historian would take the stage and then update the story, as it were, by saying, giving a talk about the specific woman. Fox had written these essays back in the early 1930s, so it was interesting to have people talk about the same subjects all these years later. And I'll just finish up talking today by talking a little bit about Dora Maguire, because she is the most obscure of the 12 subjects. Everybody knows about Countess Markievicz, Maud Gonne, Hanna Sheehy-Skeffington, and so on. But if it were not for Rebel Irishwomen, Dora Maguire would be practically invisible in historical works ever since. So she was born in London. She became a nurse and was active in England during the First World War, which very badly affected her health. She suffered from tuberculosis during the First World War, and she died quite young. But she moved to Ireland during the War of Independence. She did have some family in the north of Ireland, and she was educated there for a while. And during the War of Independence, she became very interested in what was happening in Ireland. She had a sister and brother-in-law living in Dublin, and she came over to Dublin to live with them when her father passed away. And it was particularly the action of the Black and Tans that really persuaded her to embrace Irish republicanism. And she also changed from Protestantism to becoming a Catholic. And when she moved to Dublin, she got a job at St. Ultan's Children's Hospital in Ranelagh, set up by Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine French Mullen. And there's going to be a plaque in Ranelagh soon by Dublin City Council commemorating the founding of that hospital. And when she was living in that area of Dublin in 1925, she got herself arrested. She got herself in trouble. There was a cinema in Rathmines called the Princess Cinema, known to locals as the Prinner. And in August 1925, the cinema showed a small silent movie about the Prince of Wales and a recent tour he had been doing in South Africa. And Republicans were angry about cinemas in Ireland showing these propaganda films, as they were referred to, or British films. And there was talk about having protests outside cinemas. But Dora decided to take matters into her own hands. And on the 6th of August 1925, after finishing work, she went into the local cinema. She had a large pot of ink in one of her pockets. And then once the movie started and the orchestra started playing music to correspond with the film footage, she stood up and threw the pot of ink at the screen, causing over £6 worth of damage. £6 was a lot of money back then. So she was in all the newspapers, and she refused to recognize the authority of the judge. She spent a little bit of time in jail. And when I talked about Dora Maguire back in 2018 at the GPO Museum, there was a Dublin artist, a friend of mine called Aidan J. Collins, who was so interested in the story of her vandalizing the cinema screen that he decided to turn the story into a comic strip. So very quickly he drew out these 8 panels in pencil. And then throughout 2018 and into 2019, he decided to create digital panels. And he created this digital sort of comic strip called The Spirit of Dora Maguire. And the title was taken from R.M. Fox, talking about her having the spirit of Dora Maguire being the same as the spirit of 1916. And I'll just show you these panels that he drew. Begins at St. Ultan's Hospital with Dora talking to Dr. Kathleen Lynn. You can see the pot of ink on the table, and also the framed portrait of Countess Markievicz over on the right-hand side. And when she goes to the cinema, she gets her ticket for the propagandist film, which the cinema manager is not particularly happy with the description there, to see this footage of the Prince of Wales' tour in South Africa. And then when the film is being shown inside the cinema screen, a lot of the locals were delighted to see this footage, but Dora instead stood up with her pot of ink, and as she told the policeman who arrested her, she had no objection to the Prince of Wales on a personal level, but she objected to the British rule in Ireland because they helped the black and tan. She was still very bitter about what had happened during the War of Independence. And because of the way cinemas were back then, not only did she destroy the screen, but she also destroyed the clothes and the musical instruments and the sheets of music of the orchestra that were sitting in front of the screen. And she said during the court case that although she did not recognize the judge or the sentence he was going to pass on her, she would be happy to reimburse the women who were in the orchestra if they called to her house. She was living actually with Dr. Kathleen Lynn. And here you can see her being taken away by one of the police officers. She said in court that one of the policemen told her that she did good and that the Union Jack was a rag. And she also made people laugh because she said that the manager of the cinema, when he found out why she had done what she did, said, "Why did you not go to the Stella Picture House around the corner instead to carry out your protest?" Here we can see a panel that's uncompleted, just referring to the compensation she was happy to give them, but not because the judge told her to. And then the comic strip finishes with Dora returning to St. Ultan's and looking for overtime because of the hefty fine that she'd received for the vandalism. So that's the comic strip then, the spirit of Dora Maguire. She left St. Ultan's in Dublin shortly afterwards. She worked in a few different places before returning, but her health was really bad throughout the 1920s. It had been bad since the First World War, but she still would always be out protesting about Republican prisoners, hunger strikers, and so on, even if it really affected her health. And she passed away in 1931. She was only 41 years of age and had just got married, and she's buried in an unmarked grave at Glasnevin Cemetery. So she's not in the Republican plot at Glasnevin, like many of the other women. And when she died, she was described in one newspaper by Maud Gonne McBride as the bravest, truest comrade one could know. And on Public's newspaper, Republic newspaper, describes her in the headline as the friend of the poor. And Fox is also buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. He passed away in 1969, so a couple of years after the second edition of Rebel Irishwomen was published. And then his wife, Patricia Lynch, joined him there 3 years later. And in the gravestone, Fox is described simply as an author and journalist. Patricia Lynch, just with one word, storyteller. And that's a word that could be used, I think, to describe R.M. Fox just as well. Certainly in her review of Rebel Irishwomen that I showed you earlier on, Dorothy McCardle, who went on to write that famous book, The Irish Republic, in 1937. It's a history of the Irish Revolution written from an anti-treaty perspective. But she uses that term of storyteller to describe Fox during her review of the book. She says that it is not a book that every journalist could have written, this study of Rebel Irishwomen. Much skill was needed, not only to evoke the contrasts and divergences of character among the individual women portrayed, but to suggest the continuous struggle and the varied historic incidents in which their personal stories were involved. All of this has been done by R.M. Fox with fine dramatic art. He proves himself to be a born storyteller, seizing upon those little details which give warm human life to the narrative, lightening up every page with picturesque incident, amusing anecdote, crisp dialogue, or sharp repartee, and keeping the whole realistic, simple, and sincere. The author has written a sincere book about sincere people. And you can see the headline there, 12 Rebel Irishwomen Studies in Sincerity. So there you have it then, R.M. Fox's Rebel Irishwomen, published in 1935 and 1967. It's a lot easier to get hold of the 1967 edition, but there are a few copies around in different libraries. There's one in the National Library of Ireland, and also you can access both editions in the Dublin City Library and Archive at Pearse Street. And you can pick up copies of the books online. Every so often you do manage to get a bargain when they're getting sold. But some of you might be aware, I recently taught a course on the Irish Revolution for different libraries, a 12-week course. And every week after the lectures, we would discuss one of the different essays from the book. And I'm hoping to do that again in January, February, March, when I'm teaching my course, hopefully for Finglas Library. Because of everything that's happening in the world, we're likely going to be doing it on Zoom again. So it's a 12-week course looking at Irish history from 1916 to 1923. And then after the lectures, we discuss a primary source every week, and also one of the different essays from the book Rebel Irishwomen, which ties in with that particular class. But until then, just to let you know, you can see videos. I do short videos usually every week, either for the Historians in Residence DCC Facebook page, and also for my History of Dublin YouTube channel, where I talk about sculptures in Dublin, plaques, books, old photographs, etc. And the logo, History of Dublin, was designed by the same artist, Aidan J. Collins, who created that comic strip, The Spirit of Dora Maguire, we saw earlier. And I'll just finish up by showing you a list of the 12 women covered in Rebel Irishwomen. So thanks very much for your time this afternoon.